Dr. De Wit, it's great to be with you.
Nice to talk to you.
So, how did this all start for you, researching psychedelics and other drugs? Basically, how did you get into drugs?
Actually, I've been studying drugs for all of my academic career. I started out studying animal models of drug taking. So it turns out that rodents, will self-administer just about all the same drugs that humans will, with some interesting exceptions. But then well, that was for my doctoral research. And then when I came to do a postdoc, and where I stayed for the next 40 years, I switched over to studying humans. And most of the work was in the context of studying drugs that have some potential to be misused or abused. So that might be alcohol, it might be nicotine, might be caffeine. So drugs that are used for non-medical purposes. So I've been studying drugs like amphetamine and alcohol and Valium and nicotine and caffeine for many, many years. And then one drug, I got interested in one drug in particular, and that was MDMA, or ecstasy. So, and I was interested in particular because it's very similar to stimulant drugs like amphetamine, methamphetamine, and I had been studying amphetamines for a long time. But people were saying that there's something quite different about MDMA, that it's different from the other stimulant-like drugs. And they were saying it produces these pro-social effects and makes people feel connected with each other, and it's kind of makes them more in contact with emotions and that kind of thing. And as an experimental psychologist, that made me curious. So I thought, well, I wanted to know, and that's the kind of work that I do, what is it that's different about MDMA, and how does it affect people's behavior in a way that regular stimulants don't? So you can ask the question, so if they say it increases, people say it increases empathy, you can ask the question, well, what is empathy? Is it the ability to detect emotions in other people, or is it your emotional reaction to other people's emotions, or is it just that it makes you feel more social? And there are existing kind of standardized tasks to measure many of those things. And so I studied MDMA for maybe 10 years or something like that, looking at these kinds of things. So for example, there's one task that measures social rejection. It's kind of a ball tossing game where it's on a computer, but the people toss a ball at you it's a game, and they include you for a while, and then at some point in the game they stop throwing the ball to you. So it's a rejection phase, and people report feeling rejected. It feels unpleasant when they don't include you. And so the MDMA actually makes them feel less rejected. So it's a model of social rejection. And so we've done a whole series of studies looking at how MDMA is different and what these kind of pro-social effects are. And then maybe 3 or so years ago, one of my graduate student who was working with me, who's now a resident, she did an MD and a PhD, she brought to my attention this idea about microdosing, and I thought I was intrigued by it. And again, I wanted to see what it is that this drug does, that it changes people's behavior. So just in case you don't know what microdosing is, it's people report taking LSD and sometimes other psychedelic drugs as well, but at very, very low doses. And they take it every 3 or 4 days, and then they report feeling better mood and more positive and better cognition. In all kinds of ways, they report feeling better. So the doses that they use for this are in the range of 10 to 30 micrograms. And to put that into perspective, the doses that you use to have an actual trip are in the range of 100 to 200 micrograms. So this is like a tenth of the amount that you need to really have perceptual experiences. So the idea is that the drug has not very much effect immediately, but then somehow over time it makes you feel better. And there's some good scientific rationale for this idea, because LSD actually works on the serotonin receptors, and of course the serotonin system is where antidepressants work as well. So there's some kind of neurobiological reason why the LSD might have some antidepressant effects. So we've now started a series of studies where, and another thing to say about the microdosing is that it hasn't really been studied under controlled circumstances very much. And when people microdose in their own natural situations, they all have strong expectations that this drug is going to do something good for them. No, so the problem with that is the expectancies could be driving the reported effects rather than the pharmacological effects. And so that's where I come in as a scientist. I want to administer the drug under blinded conditions, so neither the experimenter nor the subject know what they're getting, and so they can't have strong expectations of how it's going to. And so then I want to know if you don't have expectations, whether there's an improvement in mood. So we've started some studies like that, and I don't have an answer yet. It's very challenging work to do. It takes a lot of kind of regulatory, you have to go through a lot of regulatory steps to get access to the drug. And then there are also challenges in running the studies. So I don't have an answer yet, but that's what I'm doing. That was a long answer.
Yeah, well, it's very exciting, and I think it will come as a big surprise to some folks if they're not familiar with this kind of psychedelic renaissance that's taking place, to hear these talked about in the context of improving mental health and being studied in a very rigorous scientific way because of the history of psychedelics in the US, with the whole kind of hippie movement and the then subsequent classification of a lot of these compounds as very illegal, I guess class 1, illegal narcotics, and then only recently kind of being shown to, coming back and being studied in a way that is showing a lot of promise. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics and also like what compounds we're really referring to here when we talk about psychedelics more broadly.
There are maybe 5 or so different categories of psychedelic drugs, and they act via different neurotransmitter systems. And I'm sorry, I can't give you list them all right here offhand. But they include things, it sort of depends on what you call psychedelic as well. So some of them might be drugs like phencyclidine or PCP that produce some weird experiences, and it might be like morning glory, the plant that acts on a different mechanism. But the ones that we're probably most familiar with are ones that work on the serotonergic system, serotonin system. That's a neurotransmitter system. So they have been around for a very long time. The class of drugs have been around for a very long time and historically used in religious circumstances, often in ceremonial kind of settings over many centuries, basically. And then I guess it's fair to say that in the 60s, they kind of, in the 1960s, they kind of gained a lot of attention as drugs. I think that, anyway, it's hard to summarize the whole, I'm not the best person to summarize the whole history of them, but they gained a lot of popularity. They became part of the hippie culture, as you say, in the 60s, and were used very widely. It so happens that around the same time, they were also being used a lot for psychotherapy, for therapeutic purposes, but that sort of got lost when they fell out of fashion and they became illegal in the, I think in the early 80s, basically, and they became Schedule I drugs and not available. So they became scheduled because of the recreational use, but it turned out there was already a literature on effects of possible antidepressant effects of drugs like LSD. And so now people are kind of revisiting that. And I've described my studies looking at microdosing, but there are also a whole series of studies now that it started maybe 10 years ago that aren't looking at high doses of psilocybin or LSD as possible medications in a psychiatric setting. So they're using, and in that case, it's not using the drug repeatedly over days, but rather a single administration followed maybe 3 months later by another administration. And in those studies, the participants are prepared for the session. They undergo extensive preparation with a guide, and then they're in the session for a long period of time with a guide, and they're kind of trained to kind of address their experiences, and then they have follow-up sessions to process what happened. And now, and so first of all, it was described as kind of a spiritual experience, and it was studied as a spiritual experience. But now this has been extended to looking at possible antidepressant effects. It's the psilocybin has been used in a smoking cessation study. It's been used for end of life anxiety, and so they're reaching out and applying it to psychiatric problems and also kind of life problems and stressors. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm about. You've probably read the book How to Change Your Mind, the Michael Pollan book, and so he gives a really nice kind of overview of the kind of of all aspects of it, the history of it, the research that's going on, and then also his own experience with it from a kind of from a skeptic's point of view, but he recognizes the power of these drugs. So let's see, I've lost track of what the question that you asked me.
Yeah, no, that was great.
Something about the history of it, and then so that they were used in the 60s, and then they became illegal, and then it was quiet for a very long time. That is, there was no research, there was no legitimate research going on, but presumably people continued to use some of those drugs. And but now, especially with the studies that were initiated by Roland Griffiths at Hopkins, the psilocybin research has really been revived.
And so, as you referred to, there's really three ways these tools are being used. They're being used irresponsibly in some cases, just get high at a party and see what happens. Then there's the two responsible uses, which, as you said, is the clinical trials going on to treat mental disorders. And then there's more enhancing cognitive function with microdosing, which has become a big thing in Silicon Valley, even illegally, kind of under the table, people taking, instead of a gram of mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, they would take a tenth of that, for example, and get these almost sub-perceptual effects and go on a regimen of doing that like every third day. So there's kind of two different things going on here. There's there's the larger dose, like clinical trials, and then also clinical trials with microdosing, like it sounds like you're doing with MDMA. And then there's also the microdosing going on, which is, I think, Colorado. I was just told on the phone yesterday that you can already legally buy psilocybin microdoses in Denver, Colorado now. So
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it seems like things are really changing quickly.
The other group that's done a lot with changing attitudes towards these drugs is the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, I think it's called. And they've been trying to get FDA approval for MDMA in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And they've come along really well on that. I think they're in phase 3 trials, and it's going really well. And so that's a remarkable thing. So that's MDMA given during a session with a psychotherapist, and the MDMA seems to make people more able to process their own negative thoughts and their negative material. And I've heard a few testimonials of people who've gone through that process, people who were veterans, for example, with PTSD, and it's quite remarkable. So that's another kind of a potential with MDMA as an adjunct in the treatment in psychotherapy.
Yeah, I've heard about that trial. Apparently this I guess phase 2 or stage 2 of that clinical trial went incredibly well. Like there were I'm going to get these numbers precisely wrong, but the general gist was that these are people who on average had PTSD for 17 years, and after just, I think it was 2 sessions of a one-off dose of MDMA, a year later, they no longer had PTSD as it's clinically defined.
Amazing.
And that was about 56% of them. So, and these were people who had tried other treatments, 17
Right.
years of PTSD, and suddenly
Right.
2 sessions later. But obviously, that's not very profitable for the drug companies.
That's right.
So, what do you
That's
see?
absolutely right. Yeah.
Do you think there's gonna be some pushback in that sense from these
I
drug
don't think so.
companies?
I think it'll be a different model. I think it won't be the mainstream pharmaceutical industry that will get involved in it. I think it would be made available, and it would have to be available under very controlled circumstances, because you don't want to use it irresponsibly. So it would be, I imagine there would be clinics set up that are for psychotherapy, that, you know, provide the behavioral therapy together with the drug administration under very controlled environments. So you know, I think it's always going to be a little bit limited, just because it's a drug that has potential to be misused.
Mm. Yeah, another thing you mentioned earlier is just the importance of expectation and the set and setting. Could you talk a little bit more about how these are being applied, and
Yeah,
how do you think about that issue?
yeah. Well, it's a challenge for sure. I mean, we've done studies ourselves where we manipulate people's expectations. So we either tell them that they're going to get a drug, or that they're going to get a placebo, and then they either get a drug or get a placebo. And so with a drug like caffeine, you can do this. You can say, well, you've been assigned to the group where you're going to get caffeine, and then give them caffeine, or give them placebo. So you can. It's a little trickier to do with a drug that's really has powerful effects, so it's really hard to blind it. On the other hand, we know that from the controlled studies, we know that the expectation of receiving a drug produces a lot of the effects of the drug itself, or what people think it's going to do. And there's even a study, a publication with microdosing, where they had people say what they expected to experience, and then had them actually record what they did experience, and there were some interesting differences. So it depends on what you're interested in. I'm interested in the pharmacology of it, and so what does the drug actually do? But it could be that the beneficial effects of the drug might be a combination of having certain expectancies and then giving the drug as well. So it might somehow transform the drug effect in such a way that would be beneficial, and that you might not want to get rid of the expectancies. And certainly for these high dose psilocybin studies, there's no way you would want to give a drug like that in a situation where the subjects are not prepared, and where they don't know what they're in for. So part of it is feasibility. Part of it is what question you're asking. Yeah. So these are all different aspects of the problem.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So there's like understanding the brain mechanisms and how much of it is just the drug versus the placebo. And then on the other case, there's just coming up with the best therapy possible and comparing it against current practices to see if you could improve it with whatever kind of, you'd want to use the placebo as much as possible, ideally.
Exactly.
To get the biggest effects.
Yeah.
So what are the basic brain mechanisms going on here? You've already mentioned the serotonin system a little bit. Do you think you could talk a little bit about just what's going on in the brain when someone takes a compound of this nature?
Well, at the high doses, I guess the most vivid example is giving higher doses of either LSD or psilocybin. And as you can imagine, there are certain connections that the brain habitually uses. So, the connection from region A to region B is what you use all the time. So there are these kind of fixed patterns. And what the LSD or psilocybin does is it disturbs those fixed patterns. And so then you get increased connections between regions of the brain that don't normally talk to each other. So it looks a little bit like chaos, or it looks like a kind of disorder in a sense. But what can we tell from looking at pictures of the brain like that? It doesn't really translate into the experience of it or what's really happening. So, but that is one finding. And so how it actually changes behavior, I don't know. The LSD acts on a particular serotonin 2A receptor, and it sits there, and we still don't know exactly what the function of that receptor is, or how, and it's not, and no single receptor is going to have a whole function. It's everything's working together. So I'm waving my hands here because we don't really know.
Yeah, well, I think I feel like as scientists need to be more comfortable saying that than, like, often a lot of these things are being oversimplified for the public or whatever, and it's it's better if we don't jump to those conclusions too soon, especially
Yeah.
since there's already, this is the third wave of psychedelics. If you think about the first wave as the shamans, the second wave as the hippies, this third wave is our chance to get it right. And so we need to apply science in
Right,
the right
right, right.
in the right way, and not get overexcited by it or jump to oversimplified conclusions. So I
Right.
appreciate that. And one analogy that made a lot of sense to me was that this idea that basically the psychedelic, in some ways, if you get stuck in a mental rut, a repeated story in your mind, the psychedelic is almost like laying down a fresh coating of snow on a mountain. It's as if you've been skiing down the same tracks, and a fresh coating of snow is laid down by this experience that takes you out of that story for some time and allows you to form a new path or a more useful story in your mind. And it seems like that can explain, just that basic analogy can explain a lot of the positive benefits that are in how they're being used to treat, for example, anxiety and depression, that are largely disorders of getting stuck in a story and a narrative in the mind. Does
I
that
agree.
hold
And
up?
actually, I think it's also how a lot of other therapeutic approaches work. People give shock therapy, and that's also causing a lot of disorder. And then the idea, in principle, is that it reconstructs itself in a more orderly way. Or, people used to use cold hydrotherapy, put them in cold water, or and then for that matter, psychotherapy is a way of helping people reach new insights and reach new in a much more painful and slow way. But that's the idea, is to kind of form new perspectives in a sense, or figure out new ways to frame problems, that kind of thing.
What do you see as the biggest risks here, in terms of like concerns or pitfalls we might fall into as psychedelics are starting to come back into the mainstream?
Well, everybody's worried about kind of the drugs falling into the wrong people's hands, and then there being a lot of publicity about them, in negative publicity, or people trying to use them for purposes that are maybe we see as irresponsible. It might be to change people's minds about, say they started using it to change people's minds on political issues or
Mm,
something like that. That would be, and if once you've sort of shown that it can change people's perspectives, then it could get into the wrong hands, and people would change
mm,
people's perspectives for the wrong reasons. So
yeah.
uh, I think they are very powerful drugs, and they need to
Mm,
be controlled in some way. I don't think there's
mm,
any way. I'm surprised. I'm impressed that Colorado's made microdosing legal, but uh, 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 the higher doses, I think there are a lot of potential hazard. And then, if a lot of people are tripping, and something's going to go wrong, just
yeah.
like it did in the 60s. Somebody's going to jump out of a window, or injure someone else, or and then there will be all this terrible publicity, and it doesn't take very much bad news to turn everything around.
Yeah, it strikes me as similar to, even if Tesla, for example, develops a self-driving autonomous vehicle that's safer than every regular car out there that's driving with someone who can easily be distracted by their phone, if it hits one person, as it did, a few months back, suddenly that really halts any
That's right.
progress that they've made, because with any new technology, people are going to be skeptical. So I
That's
think
right. That's
you're
right.
right. That's a big concern. But if everything goes as you're hoping it will, what do you think is the future of psychedelics in our country and more broadly?
I think as a tool in psychiatry and medicine, it that has real potential.
Mm,
There are lots of people who would go way farther than that. A lot of people who have used psychedelic drugs uh, kind of become, uh, converts in a sense, and
mm,
they think it's a solution for many of the world's ills. And it's kind of interesting, because it's almost as though it's a pharmacological effect of the drug that makes people feel such profound change.
mm,
But whether it can really address the world's other problems of wars and injustice and poverty and all the other bad things.
Mm.
I'm not sure. So yeah,
Yeah.
seems unlikely.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I can just speak from my own experience. A couple of experiences that I've had on psychedelics have been the most, certainly, and I know this is, a lot of people will claim this, the most meaningful experiences in my life, not because they offered some insight into what I thought was ontologically a more real reality or something. It was more an insight that came back with me, like, oh, you'll be happier if you start being a better person, or just taking a little bit of MDMA and noticing that, wow, the mind does have this capacity to just love everybody, and if only I could tap into that more often. And the pharmacy of my brain is doing that. I have that capacity. If only I could, get into this place more often.
Fascinating. It's just fascinating. Fascinating. And to what extent, yeah, it can, what the experience is and how the cognitions can go along with it, and then that it can have lasting significance. One of the examples that Michael Pollan gives in his book, an example of one of these epiphanies, and
Mm.
this, somebody had taken the drug and they said something really, really important had happened to
Yeah.
them. And he said, well, okay, what was it? And he said, I understand we are mortal. And and so he had a depth of understanding that people are going to die eventually, and the author said, well, uh, a lot of people have known that for a long time, and
Right.
people have been writing about that for a long time, but it was the strength of the experience somehow that was
Yeah.
important there.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the ineffability and the difference between like wisdom and experiential understanding versus factual knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows we're going to die, but have you really come to grasp? Have you really and obviously he was speaking from the place of having really understood that for the first
Yeah.
time, that he's not going to exist someday.
Interesting. Very
Finally,
interesting.
just, I'm curious about the research that's most exciting to you with regards to psychedelics. It could be some own studies that you're conducting right now, or findings that you're hopeful about.
I think right now my goal and my interest is fairly narrow, and that is to see whether there really is any kind of behavioral or mood change with these repeated low doses, and then
Mm,
if so, what is it? Is it a mood change? Is it a cognition thing? Is it
mm,
like antidepressant drugs? Is it a similar sort of effect? Does it affect everybody or only certain people? And then ultimately I'd be interested in asking about the interaction with expectancies and the pharmacological effects. I think that's really
mm,
fascinating. So that if you have both, then if you have both the expectancy and the drug, do you get more of an effect than if you get one or the other? So
mm,
those are all questions. So my interest right now is fairly narrow to that question of
mm.
what's going on there, and it's partly because it's kind of new territory, so it's fun.
Yeah. And I know as a scientist you have to remain objective, but is your intuition telling you that there are permanent, lasting neural traits created by repeated use of these things? Or does it create a dependency? Like, what
I
is
see.
what is the
Hmm.
early
Uh,
result?
I guess I wouldn't use the word permanent, but I think it stands to reason that there might be an improvement in mood states or even
Mm,
cognitive function while you're under. I see it a little bit like an SSRI, like an
okay.
antidepressant drug, that it doesn't produce a lot of effects directly of its own, but it makes you feel better over time. So that's kind of the best analogy that I can think of. The question of whether there are any adverse effects when you stop using, I have no idea, no idea.
Mm.
And yeah, that's another question, remains to be seen.
Yeah, well, this is such a fascinating topic, and really excited to see where all this heads. If folks want to follow your research or just learn more about what you're working on, where can they where would you direct them?
I guess they can look me up on the internet, and there will be a web page for my lab, and it describes what we do.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate the work you're doing.
All right, nice to meet you.